love your power color. Your shirt's awesome.
Well, thank you. Well, red's on brand for us. This is actually, so this is one of 5 shirts that we sell at shopdavidburkus.com, which exists solely because I have a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old who are obsessed with YouTubers. Yes. So I started my own channel and they told me I wasn't a real YouTuber unless I sold merch.
Truer words were never spoken.
Right. I didn't know what that was. But I asked them about it and figured out like, it's not hard to impress a 9-year-old. So I figured out like, oh, here's the website. They can do it for me. And so we started a merch store. And so we sell merch now solely so that my 9-year-old and 7-year-old are impressed that I'm a real YouTuber.
Perfect. I like it. I remember when Ashley and I started the podcast, I didn't know what merch was. I said, what are you talking about? She said, merchandise.
Yeah.
Felt like an idiot.
You gotta have something. I mean, with as many quotes, I mean, I'm assuming failure is feedback. Is that your quote?
I don't think it's actually in any of the books. It's just a good life motto. So we have 5 shirts. One that says creativity is a team sport, which is in the book.
Ooh, that's a good one.
No, that's actually probably the only one that's actually in the book. The rest, and then the one that's most common, I wear it a lot on the videos I film for. It says people don't work for you, which is, I was asked in an interview like 3 or 4 years ago, if you could put one thing on a billboard, what would it be? And I was like, that's what I would put. I would put people, because they have their own reasons, and you're lucky enough to get them to volunteer to work for your company in exchange for pay. And if you don't have that mentality, then you're probably going to end up misusing them, mistreating them, or something like that. So, yeah.
I agree. I've been in management for 30 years. That is absolutely true.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of people don't realize we need to flip that hierarchy too, right? Like if anything, if you're in a management leadership role, like you work for them, your job is to figure out what they need to do their job and get it for them. Right. So
exactly. Yeah. We just had a team meeting today, and that's exactly what I said. You guys, here's the problem. We'll figure it out. We don't need to do an A3 on it, but let's figure out what we're doing. And you guys talk about it, throw out ideas, and it worked. And we've got a plan moving forward. So it was awesome.
Yeah, love it. Love it.
Yeah. So let's introduce David.
Yeah, sorry. Like we're jumping right onto shirts and colors, and you don't even know why you should be listening to the show, but we're already like 3 minutes in. Sorry about that.
No, that's how we roll. We just roll with it. I met David on a Project Management Institute book club, and the book was Leading from Anywhere. Oops, hope I don't have too much of a glare on it.
Who knows, that looks familiar.
It does look familiar.
So good she got it from the library.
I did, but you know why?
It's shade.
No. It's because it's on my Kindle. And I have it on Audible as well. So I listen to you when I'm walking, but I did want to reread the written version.
Oh, you mean you listen to me drone on for 6 hours on the Audible version?
I actually do. Yeah. You know what my favorite book, though, is Under New Management.
Oh, thank you. That one's the same red. See?
Yeah. I see.
If you're listening to this as the podcast, I don't know how we're going to bring you in and include you here, but yeah.
The Myths of Creativity is another one. Another book. Love that. There is some really thought-provoking pieces in that book. And then Friend of a Friend of a Friend of a Friend, Networking. Okay. Love this book. It's spot on.
Well, so you went to the library and checked out all 4. They must have thought you were crazy.
They said, Robin, can we talk to you about this? And you also have another one. It's Audible only. And
Pick a Fight, which is one of my I was going to say one of my favorites, but they're like kids. Like they're all one of my favorites. That was a fun project that I'll give you the inside baseball scoop, right? Because this is a more free flowing show. So that was an idea that the publisher that I work with didn't want. So I pitched it to them and they were like, nah, we don't really see it, what have you, come back with a different idea. And I couldn't get any other worthwhile ideas until I felt like, let me get this one out of my head. Right. Mm-hmm. So I spent kind of 5 or 6 months writing it. I had no deal, was supposed to be working on a proposal for a book for said publisher, but instead was just kind of writing that one and got it to about 20,000 words. And I was like, I'm finished. And now I know why they didn't want it, because it's not long enough to be a book. Like 20,000 words is maybe 75 pages, right? And so I'm like, okay, I get why they don't want it, but what are we going to do with this thing? And luckily we managed to sell Audible on the idea. Audible's done a really good job being more than books, right? So they're all sorts of different audio programming now and what have you. So we managed to sell them on the idea, and it's been this kind of an exclusive. But now it's sort of weird, because now at least once a week I get emails from people. Is there a hard copy version of this? Is there a Kindle version? Nope. Audible was the only one that believed in it. So Audible's the only one that gets it.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, tell us about your journey, because you were also a professor. And then you are the world's foremost forward-thinking author, TED Talk speaker, book club guest, and now
more like book club crasher, if I remember that particular book club right. But that's a totally different story. I don't know about world's foremost. So I was number 46 on the most recent ranking of Thinkers 50. So that's pretty low. That's pretty low to that's I mean, it's better than being 51. That's true. But yeah, so the interesting thing is, so I was a full-time business school professor. Have a doctorate that I never cite because my wife is an ER doctor, so I don't feel like a real doctor, so I never refer to myself as one. But what a lot of people don't know is that and then became a writer, but what a lot of people don't know is the writer was always the plan, right? So I went to my undergraduate degrees in English and creative writing, like literally as 17 years old, picking college, wanted to be a writer. Had no idea this genre of books even existed, right? When you're as dumb as a 17-year-old, you like, nonfiction means textbooks, right? So you think fiction, and you think novelist or poet or playwright or all of those sort of things. So I went to school for that. I learned a really interesting lesson, which is that most people who want to be novelists starve unless they get a job teaching other people who want to be novelists, right? Like, so this is, and then maybe 0.1% of them actually don't starve and make a successful living as an actual novelist. So it became pretty obvious, this is not a great career path, right? But thankfully, in a broad liberal arts education, you have to take lots of other classes. And so I got really into psychology, and instead of taking abnormal psychology, I took an organizational psychology class, and then another, and enough to actually have a second major in that, and thought, this is what I actually want to write. I admired the folks that could really tell a story. So this was back before any of Gladwell's books, but when he wrote for the New Yorker, and there were a couple other sort of social science writers, and there's this anthology, still comes out, but there was this anthology that comes out every year called Best American Science Writing. And I thought those were fascinating, right? So that's what I decided. Okay, hey, these people, they're using every trait I'm learning in storytelling, and they're not starving, which is important, but they're helping people, and they're talking about research that's cutting edge and insights into human behavior and all that. And this is what I want to do. So I graduated it. I went to graduate school at the University of Oklahoma, Boomer Sooner, for organizational, which is, I feel bad saying because we're doing terrible this year, but for organizational psychology. And the goal was basically, if I'm being totally transparent, the goal was basically to find a job for long enough that it would take my wife to get out of medical school and residency and into being a doctor, and then quit and be a starving writer subsidized by his wife until I managed to become an overnight success 20 years later. Like, that was the real plan. Mooch off my wife. But I had chosen, as the gig in the interim, I'd chosen to go to work for a pharmaceutical company. I worked in sales and marketing for a pharmaceutical company. And I spent about 5 years there as I kept just racking up extra classes, eventually halfway through a doctoral program, just because I wanted to learn more about organizational psychology, wanted to write more about organizational psychology, et cetera. While during the day, I was selling drugs, literally selling drugs, legally selling drugs. And then 2009, the Affordable Care Act passed, which had in it a lot of provisions around how pharmaceuticals and medical devices could be marketed that no one ever talks about, but they were there in the bill. And I looked at it and I thought, at least 40% of this industry is about to get laid off. Like, they don't know it yet, but this is going to change it because we're not good at change, right? And so we have these massive regulations that change. And I thought I should look for a lifeboat. And the lifeboat turned out to be teaching, right? Totally accidental. I feel bad saying that because some people go to graduate school sort of praying to get that academic job. And I was like, well, plan A didn't work. So I guess plan B is I'll go. So I started adjuncting for a couple different places. That turned into a full-time gig at Oral Roberts for 6 years. Ton of fun, awesome. Taught MBA students and even some undergrads. The undergrads are actually more fun to teach because they have so much more energy and they don't think they know everything, unlike the MBA students. But the goal throughout all of that was still build a platform. I still was full-time when I published the first book, actually, and the second, and under new management. But that was like my final year as full-time. So it didn't work out the way I expected, but truthfully, the plan worked out a bit better because I never had to do the whole, I'm just going to quit and be a struggling writer mooching off his wife thing. I never had to do that. I got to do it a little bit more legit way. That's a really sort of odd version of the story. I bet if you'd gave me more time, I could have made it sound more intentional and like more like a grandiose plan and what have you. But
that's the beauty of the podcast is that a lot of us got where we're at completely accidentally. And by the way, I did take abnormal psych for you, so don't worry about that.
Yeah.
My undergrad is in psych.
I think that would have ruined me, to be honest with you, if I had to, because like that, yeah, that would have ruined me. The fact that I got to take the psychology of like healthy, motivated people, that made me think this is fascinating, right? So
That's like I've never taken a psychology course, but I think you're right. I think it would mess me up.
I mean, that said, like I'm fascinated with writers like John Ronson and other people who have delved into insights around the abnormal psych world. I don't know that I could write stuff like that. I really love that I get to use writing to help people. It's a really fortunate thing. And I mean, I suppose if you study abnormal psychology, you help people too, but you know what I'm saying.
We get it.
It wasn't until like years ago that I realized that like just where you are mentally makes all the difference, or just or understanding yourself is part of the battle. I don't know. I just thought, years ago I was like unmotivated or something. It's like you have to know kind of about yourself to how I thought. Maybe that's wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so there's this thing that we teach in every undergrad psychology course called Maslow's hierarchy of needs that is totally wrong, right?
That is. It's
right.
wrong.
You know what that is? This has never really been proven well in research. My buddy Scott Barry Kaufman.
You've already taught me something brand new.
There you go. Well, there's an element of truth to it, which is that people are motivated towards different categories of things, right? Mm-hmm. It's the idea of a hierarchy and that you don't progress up the hierarchy unless certain things. That's never been proven in any real research. It's an interesting idea, but that categorization piece, and then the fact that really, I think the real extension of that categorization piece is that everyone attaches different priorities to those things, right? So Maslow would say, safety and security needs are paramount, and you can't even progress into friendship and belonging unless you have that. No, some people are so motivated to get along, they're willing to sacrifice safety, right? And so it's more about those.
A lot of people like that.
Right. And so it's more about those categorizations. And so I'd call that, like, if you're talking about getting to know yourself and what have you, I do think you have to get real insight into that element of, okay, which of these categories kind of actually motivates me, et cetera, in order to build a life and a job. I mean, you add into that in the context of work, you add into that, okay, what are my actual strengths and weaknesses? And I prefer the sort of Marcus Buckingham take on strengths and weaknesses, which isn't that strengths are things you're good at and weaknesses are things you're bad at, but strengths are things that make you feel strong, make you feel energized, make you feel engaged. And as a result, you do them more, and so you get good at them. But they're more about that. You've got to learn a lot of that too. And really, we still do a terrible job teaching people under 20 how to figure that stuff out, right? I mean, when I was a full-time business school professor, I'd give them an assignment actually from Marcus, where I would have them carry around a little notepad for an entire week and pay attention to anything they did that got them really exhilarated or really frustrated them, and write it down. And at the end of the week, we could like zoom out and go, these are all the activities that you enjoy. These are the things you really, really loathe. Now let's talk about what the right types of jobs for you are and all of that sort of stuff. Because we don't think about that. I mean, how many times have you heard of somebody spending all 3 years at law school thinking that it's going to be exactly like Law and Order, and then they realize that your job is actually librarian and they hate it. Now they never use their law degree, right? Because no one took the time to go, okay, what things actually motivate you, but what things make you feel strong, what things energize you, and what things don't. We should probably use that to guide our decision about what you should do.
How do you think we change that in our system? Because I mean, I think, and you have young children, so I mean, when as a kid, I was never taught about, you're taught to the test, and you're taught, you should get this degree because it makes a lot of money, which we can go into later. But it's, how do we change it? I know you said we're not really great at change. How do we get that started at a younger age? I don't even know if there's an answer to that.
Yeah. So my kids are 9 and 7.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know that I have the right answer, right? Like, check back with me in a decade and we'll make sure that they're like not in prison, right? And gainfully employed and that sort of thing. I might be totally wrong here experimenting. But I think that, the big thing I do is I try and pay attention to what they're really interested in and have conversations now about what that could lead to, right? So my 9-year-old will actually talk about his engineering skills that he gets from things like Legos and watching Mark Rober videos.
Love
and that
Lego, yeah.
Right. And so we haven't tried that conversation. This is what that leads to, right? As opposed to just, and specifically using the career terms, engineering, computer science, et cetera, not science class or math or what have you, right? So to try and get that kind of long-term focus, right? Because the subjects that we teach in school and what we call them almost never line up to the actual jobs that you do. And that's problem number one, right? Is that nobody's making that connection between that you're good at math and that this is where that heads, or that you enjoy math and this is where that heads. So that's number one. I think the second thing that we're really trying to instill in them is this idea that you also grow into stuff. Like, I don't know how many times I have said that anything worth doing is worth being bad at first to either kid, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, like, we're not really those parents that are like, you're in 17 different extracurriculars, but you always have to be in one difficult extracurricular, one thing that is actually hard. Not necessarily, right? And so literally sometimes the answer, why do I have to do this? Because it's hard. And people who do hard things get better at those hard things and get better at life, right? So that would be a couple of them. But the truth is, like, I mean, the other thing, this is terrible to admit. The other thing is that we, because school does such a bad job tracking into that, I don't know that we value school as much as we're supposed to as parents, right? Like we certainly don't map school attendance, but I don't think any parent post-COVID is really as serious about school attendance as they were before, just to be totally real. But we'd much rather pull them out of school and then take them somewhere where they can learn something in person, right? I'm not saying I would sacrifice it where they're getting terrible grades and not learning or that sort of stuff, but like, we do so much of that teach to the test, make sure your attendance is documented, this and that. No, like, I'm in charge of your learning first. The school system is the one that helps me do that. And if I think that this would be a better experience because of whatever, then I don't feel bad about you missing out on that, right?
Yeah.
And there's a whole lot of things you want to teach them that isn't taught in school, and I'd rather have you see that experience, right? So there's that too. I stole that from Bob Goff. I don't know if you know the author Bob Goff.
I love Bob Goff.
So Bob tells a story in one of his books about how his kids were learning geography and just countries and capitals, and he was like, we gotta make this more real. So what if we had you write letters to let's figure out who the monarchs of all these different countries still are. Some of them have, like, mostly the Scandinavian countries still have actual monarchs. Let's write a letter to all of the princes or kings and queens of these different European countries as you're learning about these countries. And so they did. And they got one back from like, I want to say it was like Denmark, or maybe it was Liechtenstein, like one of these tiny, tiny ones. And in the letter back, thank you so much for your note, et cetera, it said, if you're ever in Liechtenstein, let us know. We'd love to meet you. And so the kids immediately went, Dad, can we go to Liechtenstein? And he was like, sure. Yeah, let's do it. So he started planning the trip, going to meet them, et cetera. And he went and reached out to the school and he said, we're going to have to take 2 weeks off. We're going to go to Europe. We're going to do this and this. And the kids are going to meet this, what have you. And the school wrote back, you cannot have your kids miss that long a period of time of school. And Bob in the story, he goes, so I took their letter and I wrote tough at the top of it and I mailed it right back to the school and we left for Europe. Right.
Yeah.
And I love that idea, right? Is that, you want your kids to get good grades, you want them to exceed, but you want to teach them to not to the test, but to life. And sometimes that means you design experiences that conflict with what we're told we're supposed to be good at. And that's okay. I would say that's okay so long as you have a plan. Like what's not okay is to be like, oh yeah, we got this. But if you have a plan for it, I don't see the problem, right?
Yeah. Bob Goff is a funny guy. I saw him a couple of years ago at a conference, and man, does he have so many stories of
right? Yeah,
like that, where he just gets himself into these crazy situations. He'll just, he met like someone in one of these Middle Eastern countries. Yeah, just like got in a car with anyways.
Yeah, well, he is a diplomatic passport because he's an ambassador to I want to say Rwanda, I think, but it was a total fluke of how it happened and stuff. It was crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, though. Good, Rob.
What book did you enjoy the most and get the most satisfaction from?
Well, those are probably two different things, right? Right. I mean, human nature being what it is, I probably get the most satisfaction of books that remind me how smart I am because I already know all this stuff, right? Books that I have to chew with and wrestle with and figure out. Let me think about this. Well, and there are authors that do that. Like the irony of every Malcolm Gladwell book is that he's actually repackaging something we all kind of know but haven't figured out how to say, and then making it sound like it's cutting edge and actually contrarian, right? Like Blink is about how actually you can't trust your snap judgments, except sometimes you can. I mean, that's the summary of Blink. I don't know anyone that disagrees with that, right? Anyway, probably my favorite book to kind of recommend people read, it'll stretch your thinking, etc. And really it's two books now, is Roger Martin, who is the dean at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Business for the longest time, sort of an intellectual hero of mine. He did a series of interviews with different CEOs at Rotman. And what he kind of looking back on those interviews, he reflected on the idea that each of those CEOs had been successful because of what he called integrative thinking, the ability to put two different views of the world or two different mental models or what the world would predominantly say is a choice between A or B, to put them together and go, there's no reason to separate these two. We can do both, right? And so he uses examples like, an easy example everybody would know would be in the world of like competitive strategy in business. There's really only two things you can do, right? You can be the lowest cost provider, Walmart, or you can pick your niche and offer a highly differentiated service in that niche, right? So Neiman Marcus, Saks, whatever. And then there's Target, right? Which is, no, we still want to be really, really low cost, but we're going to pay a little bit of attention to design, right? We're going to be like for the discerning penny pincher, right? Right. Or if you want to go up the scale, the Four Seasons is a very different luxury brand than any of the other luxury brands because it also feels kind of homey and welcoming, whereas all of the other ones strive for that sort of stiff English butler feel, right? Yeah, you can't. So again, you're combining two things that didn't. So he put all of those interviews and those insights into a book called The Opposable Mind, which was really about what he called this idea of integrative thinking. How do you actually look at stuff in the world that the world assumes has to be in opposition and put it together? He then did a follow-up of that book, probably 7 or 8 years later, called Creating Great Choices, which was about essentially how do you teach your whole organization to think this way, right? And how do you reteach yourself this way? So probably those two in around integrative thinking. Now, I will say, I didn't enjoy either of them, right? Like I chewed on them, I wrestled with them. But months later, you're like, wow, okay, I really appreciated that, right? So yeah.
What about your own books, the ones that you've written? Which one was your, I guess, favorite, or which one did you enjoy writing the most?
Oh, see, now you're gonna make me choose
I know,
between
choose between your children.
I don't know. Pick a Fight, which was the audio project, was fun for two reasons. One, that it wasn't commissioned. So I had the ability to go wherever I wanted. Like the book could become whatever it was because I hadn't sold it to a publisher. And so I was kind of, normally I write with a plan. Like I do all the research, I map out to the point of like, this story is going in this chapter and this study needs to happen after this story. And these are the 4 takeaways at the end of the chapter. I know all of that before I sit down to start typing. Pick a Fight, I didn't know any of that. I just kind of started writing to figure it out, right? So that was a fun and different process. That said, I think the best one I've written is Leading from Anywhere, and ironically, because I had the shortest period of time to do it in. Like I was telling someone about this, I think yesterday or the day before. So that book, so Under New Management was my second book, and in that we profile a bunch of different companies that have flexible working arrangements or fully distributed companies, right? Because the idea was to shine a spotlight on companies that are doing things differently and then point out the research behind why it's working. So that led that same publisher, when COVID hit, to come back and go, well, we talked about all these different remote companies and the market, is hot for remote books. Could you write a book about being a remote company? And I actually said no, because those books already exist and they're great. But the hole in the market is teams. There's a couple great books on how to run a fully distributed company. And there's a couple great books on how to be productive when you're working from home, but nobody's writing anything towards the, I've been a manager for 15 years of teams that I shared the same office space with, and now I don't get to see them. What do I do? Right. Mm-hmm. And I thought that I'm not seeing anybody address. So I'd be interested in writing that. So they said, okay, great. And gave me a check and a deadline. And the deadline was 8 weeks away from when they gave me the check. And if I didn't hit the deadline, I had to give the check back. Right. And I don't like doing that. And nobody does.
No.
So because I was under a time crunch in a weird way, I had less time to edit. And I learned that when I edit, I try and make myself sound smarter. So in other words, I'm writing almost stream of consciousness, and I'm throwing out random things that sound funny. And then later I edit them out because I'm like, no, nobody will think that's funny or that's not useful, etc. So like, for example, in Leading from Anywhere, there's a story about a guy that or there's an aside about how you can end up serving on different teams and not really knowing which one is your real team. And I tell this aside about the fact that when I was working in the pharmaceutical company, when I was based where I am now, I had a boss who lived in a different city, but then I had 2 people who worked for the company that lived in the same city as me, but they each answered to their own boss that lived in the same city as that boss. So who is my team, right? And I have this little aside there where I say, I still don't know the answer to that question, but I know who gets a Christmas card every year, and it's not my old boss. Like, I would have edited that out if I had a year to write the book. Yeah. But I left it in. And then when I was editing it the first time, it made me laugh. And I thought, oh, that's pretty good. Like, okay, we'll leave it. Right. Yeah. So I like that one's probably my favorite for that reason. It's like a lighter, funnier read. It's probably more helpful. There's more like deliberate, do this than I've done in past books. But yeah, really, it was that more kind of freedom to just throw out random asides. Or there's a crazy story about firing a guy and telling him to bring his laptop and his keys, but never actually saying, also bring your company car. So he flew to Chicago, he drove to Chicago, parked at the airport, flew home, and then showed up with his keys and his laptop. You know where this is going, right? Where's your car? Well, my car is at Chicago airport, economy parking. Have fun, bye. Right? Like, so the whole reason I threw that story in, be really, really clear about what you need from employees. It's a great story. I would have edited it out if I had more time, but I like it better in there.
Yeah.
You would have edited that out. That's hilarious. That's a good one.
Well, Robin, you tell me, because you read it, right? Like, it's a fun story, right?
It is yes, it is. There's others too that made me chuckle. Yeah. I liked the book. I was leading remote teams before COVID hit. So for me, I came at it to book club with a completely different outlook than the majority of the members there, because I had already been doing it for years. It wasn't a new concept for me. So I think I'm going to say that my perspective was much different than some of the other members, but now we still supervise remotely. Most of our team members are in the area, so we do team lunches and we meet at the park and it's outdoor and we're socially distancing. So we still see each other, but nothing like it used to be when we were in the office. And we were able to work from home 3 times a week. So we gradually got into it prior to COVID, so it wasn't quite a shock. I'm fine with the WebEx. I love working from home. I always have. Ashley's a little bit different though.
I like people. But that's the thing is I like Zoom calls are fine. I like being around, but there's something about being in the room with someone that makes me feel so connected, which is like a question that I have is like that feeling of connection when you are socially. There's I guess you say there are two different types of people, introverts and extroverts. And then there's somewhere, there can be a scale of that too. But that feeling of connection, I think, is sometimes hard for some people. And how do you, with a team, merge both of those styles of people while still feeling like a cohesive team?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the long term, it's actually only an issue for a very small percentage of people, right? So if I had to make a prediction, where are we headed in this whole thing, right? Before the pandemic, about 4% of the American workforce, and I'm going to assume around the same numbers in Europe, and then much less so actually in Asian countries. In fact, I was invited to give a virtual talk at a business conference based in Tokyo, and they didn't want me to talk about remote because they were like, we didn't do it. Like we didn't at nearly the levels that we did anywhere else. But in let's say the West, right, which went fully, was only about 4 to 6% of employees were remote employees. I think that number, because of the pandemic, I mean, then it swelled. I know the numbers for the US. I wish they knew them for around the globe, but then it swelled to about 40 to at the peak of like our freak out, about 50%. That's it, just 50%.
Wow, that's surprising to me.
I know it feels like everyone did it, but like a
70.
lot, it turns out a lot of people are essential. I mean, that was the grand irony, right? If you were doing your work from Zoom every day, you're not actually essential. Sorry, that's totally mean.
Thanks a lot, David.
Right. Yeah, I know.
I'll be canceling this podcast.
It's such a terrible word. That's really the joke. Is it like, why are we calling that? But anyway, essential is not the right word for it. But so we went to about 50%. Post-pandemic, I think what we're going to see is a doubling of the number of people that are permanently remote. But keep in mind, a doubling means 10%, right? That means for the vast majority of people, by probably the end of 2022, we're right back where we were. With my hope, and this is why the book's called Leading from Anywhere, is the distinct angle that I tried to take is what we should actually be doing right now is learning how to give our people more trust and more autonomy and more freedom around when they work, how they work, and how we collaborate with them if they come to us and say, I'd really like to do Thursdays and Fridays from home, right? I think most people, if we say that 90%, will still probably spend a day or two or the equivalent in hours working not in the office. And so what we ought to be doing is honing the skills of remote collaboration that's why the book's called Leading from Anywhere. And we talk about working from anywhere. That's where most of us are headed. So let's use this opportunity to hone those skills, because that's where we're going. Just like Robin, like you were saying, you were already on that path. Most companies were, some begrudgingly, but almost all of us were headed to a place where we had to give people more freedom and autonomy. I wish I could say I'm really, really bullish on the idea that there'll be more totally remote companies. There won't. Like at peak, I think we're going to see a doubling. And the irony is that a doubling is 10 to 12% of the workforce.
That's so surprising. My company was not kind of already on that, I guess, train, but they quickly pivoted and now we're going hybrid, whenever that comes back. But
they probably were. We just didn't use terms like remote, right? We talked about flex time, for example, or we talked about,
3 alternative work schedules. Yeah.
Right. So we talked about we used other terms for it, right? But a lot of us were already having to head that way, right? We already realized that if you want to attract top talent, forcing them to sit at a cubicle and stare at fluorescent lights for 40 hours a week, the same 40 hours every single week, it's not going to attract them. So we were already kind of headed in that direction of a more flexible work environment, right? And what COVID did was just really kind of proved that a lot of our objections to that flexibility aren't valid.
Right. Because that, like you mentioned, people were begrudgingly doing it. But I think, at least with my company, we've learned that people are just as productive, if not more so productive.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, not surprising at all when you're not getting interrupted every 5 minutes by,
Yeah. So that's a really long-winded way of saying that the answer to your question is it may not matter because most of us are going to get those in-person experiences just less often. And by the way, I actually think that's a good thing. Like you think about in a lot of major cities anywhere in the world, you're talking about hour or sometimes 90-minute commutes into the office, and people will do that every single day. Yeah. Well, imagine if you only had to do that on Monday and it was the day you got to see all your friends from work because everyone comes in on Monday. Like now that's a little bit different commute idea, right? And now it's a little bit more tolerable. So I think that's going to change things, but I do think you're going to get a lot more once it's safe to do so. You're going to get a lot more of those in-person interactions. I have yet to work with, study, write about a fully distributed company that didn't do something to put people in a physical location. Whether that's an annual summit with everybody, whether that's a budget for the team to get together and meet every once in a while, like rent a hotel, conference space and do a week together. Or one company actually I really admire but never wrote about. They do what they call a hub strategy, where they're fully remote, fully distributed. There are no offices, but they'll only hire from 7 cities across North America so that you always have colleagues that are nearby. Right. Also, those cities are places where there are major American airport hubs so that it's easy for people to get in and out of. But the bigger benefit is that, yes, you're working remotely, but there's 7 other people in your area code that you could call up and have an in-person meeting to if you wanted to, right? So, yeah.
I think it surprised a lot of our, sorry, Robin.
That's okay. I was going to say, that's really interesting. That is an interesting concept.
Yeah, I had never really heard about it. And the irony is I know the founder of this organization and knew him before I wrote Leading from Anywhere, but totally forgot to reach out to him in that very limited window of 8 weeks where I was writing the book. And I really regret it because I would have loved to talk about that as a potential strategy. But again, like the avatar, the ideal reader of that book isn't somebody looking to build an entire remote company. It is someone who, is, I didn't sign up for this, but now I manage a team of people and I do it remotely. First of all, what do I do? And then second of all, what skills do I need to develop because they're not going away?
What's the next book?
I don't know. I'm kind of hungover from writing an entire book in 8 weeks when I normally take a year. I will tell you, so there's a next, let's call it talk and workshop, and maybe it'll turn into a book. But I was in Europe 3 weeks ago, and they have a very strong the entirety of the EU. So like 2 to 3 dozen countries all share the same database of a COVID passport. And as a result, I spoke at an event that was 1,200 people. No masks, no social distancing, check your vaccine passport at the door. And then after that, we're back to normal. And it was a really interesting glimpse into what we were talking about. This is where we're headed, right? Because we're headed to a place with more workplace flexibility, but those same places, people don't feel weird about going back to the office, right? I had a conference call earlier this week with some folks in Ireland. They're all back at the office, right? And they're still masking and social distancing. Every country is different, right? But they're back, right? And so that got me knowing these experiences were coming and knowing that Europe didn't want me to talk about remote work because they were like, yeah, we're done, right? Like not done, but the urgency isn't there anymore. I started thinking about an element that I really wanted to explore more in Leading from Anywhere, which was this idea of a team culture. So we talked early in the book about going remote and the importance of building shared understanding and shared identity at the team level, not the organization-wide level, but like training managers on how to build those two things as a team. That led me into this weird diatribe about what else do we need to build and how else could we do that and what have you. And so I came up with a talk that because my big shtick on like the podcast and the YouTube channel is I end it all by saying, and if you do this, if we do that, whatever, we'll be able to do our best work ever, right? And it's like the tagline and what have you. So I just threw it out there as the title of like, well, how do you build the best team ever, right? And so we talked about 3 elements. Shared understanding was one of them. Psychological safety, which is also in Leading from Anywhere, was one of them. And then I kind of brought back in some stuff from Pick a Fight around motivation and how do you specifically, like, apologies to Simon Sinek, I don't actually think it start with why. I think it start with who benefits from the work that we do, right? Why is important, a mission statement, et cetera, is important, but most people don't internalize a sense of purpose unless they can point to the group of people or the single person whose life is made better by the work that you do. That's when you actually know you get the why, right? So I talked about that idea of the who and what have you. And I really liked it. And I've actually delivered it as webinars a couple more times since then. And that's most of what I'm recommending when people are reaching out to me now, unless they're specifically like, how do we do this remote? Because, like your company, we're now going hybrid, moving forward, et cetera. I'm still talking to a lot of people about that. But if you give me like an open canvas to come talk about whatever I want, I'm talking about that now. And maybe it'll be a book. Maybe it'll be another piece with Audible. I have no idea, but it's a model I'm sort of playing around with. I think we talk a lot about company culture and organizational culture, and I don't think we should, because I don't think there's anything new there to say. But I do think we've underemphasized training individual team leaders on what's the culture of working on this team? We talk about employee experience from a company-wide level. And we probably should be thinking about it. What's the experience of being a member of this team? Because let's be honest, that matters more, right? The people you interact, especially in a remote world, but even in not, the people you interact with day to day shape your view of what the company is like and whether or not you want to be a part of it, way more than like the mission statement or the core values or that sort of stuff. So we ought to be focusing on that. So that's where I'll be headed. I wouldn't say that's the next book. It's not contracted. I haven't even written a proposal, et cetera. It's like an idea I'm playing around with and I kind of like it. It's like a new toy, but I don't even know what it is. I got like a little mystery box and I'm shaking it up, trying to figure out what it is.
So
could be the next TED Talk.
Yeah. I mean, I have no idea what it is, but it's fascinating, right? And that's what's kind of fun about it,
That's one thing that I think a lot of companies are starting to not struggle with, but there's a lot of dialogue around like how to acquire good employees and how to keep good employees. And what are your thoughts? I mean, I think the market has become so competitive with I think a lot of it's due to COVID, and you have so much flexibility and leverage with, this company offers me remote full time. How do you see that changing the way that I just feel like there's not just my company, but so many companies are like, the employees aren't out there. I'm like, they're out there. I think it's just they're getting certain offers. I don't know. How do you think that's going to change in the coming years?
Yeah. So, I think we talked a lot about the war for talent and the winning strategy being perks and benefits and employee experience and that sort of stuff pre-pandemic, right? Mm-hmm. We talked about Google and the free food and the beer on tap environment here. And like, I lost count of how many companies I'd tour their headquarters and be like, hey, here's our slide. Instead of going down the elevator, you can take off your shoes and go down the slide. And like, well, what do I do with my shoes that are still up there? And that's why no one uses your slide. I'm sorry, it costs you $10,000 to install it, right? Like, because we're focused on all of that sort of stuff. And then COVID was sort of a great equalizer on that, right? Because everybody's like, doesn't matter that there's free food in the company cafeteria because you're at home, right? And so I think purpose became a bigger perk. I think, the experience of working on a team that really felt collegial, like a team, became a big perk. I do think flexibility is the new signing bonus in terms of trying to attract talent. Or keep talent when you want them all back. If you're not willing to give them flexibility, you're going to say goodbye to a lot of them, right? So I think those issues matter. But I really think they underscore that like work is too important to our lives, to our identities. It's too big a percentage of our time every week to suck. And when I say that, I don't mean the difference between having free dry cleaning and not is the difference between a suck. That's never a part of what people make a decision to leave an organization for, right? It's that they don't do work, they do work that's mundane and uninspiring, or they work for a boss that's brutal and micromanaging, or they work for a team where just nobody looks out for each other and nobody cares for each other, right? My wife's a great example of this. So she's an ER doctor. She switched whole firms. And the only reason, she's basically working in the same hospital. I mean, it's across the street and it's just as well financed. The difference is her old team, nobody covered shifts for each other. Like, we had a kid in the hospital and I was in the Middle East at a speaking gig, and our kid had to be hospitalized and no one would cover her shift. So we had to call grandma and ask grandma to sit at the hospital with the 2-year-old while she went to go work at a different hospital. That was the realization, by the way, that we worked for the wrong hospital. We wouldn't even take our kid to the hospital she worked for.
Oh, wow.
So we went to work at that hospital instead. But the bigger thing was the team, right? And now she's love it. Now we've got this team camaraderie where people, like, at a moments in the last 2 days ago, she filled in 5 hours for somebody just because a life event happened. And like, we're the type of culture that does that.
Yeah.
That's where people want to work, right? And what's funny is that can't be run out of HR. That can't be run out of the recruiting department. That can't even be run at the senior leader's office. The best you can do is have those departments train leaders at every level how to build an environment like that. And so that's what I think, that's why I'm playing around with this idea. That's why I think people need to focus on it, is I think that's the solution to this sort of war for talent thing. Top talent doesn't need an organization as much as it needs them, right? And so what do they want? Well, they want to work on teams that actually engage them, inspire them. They want to do work that actually engages them, uses their skills at the right level, et cetera. So we ought to be thinking about that. And that's a much smaller conversation than these big perks and benefits and all of that sort of stuff. Those are all great. And the lack of those dissatisfy people, but that's not why people are motivated or inspired. No one at Google, 40, 50,000 employees, no one ever said, I'm so excited to get to work here because the shrimp and grits on Friday is great, right? It's a nice to have. It's great. Maybe they even looked forward to it. Maybe it helped them get out of bed on Friday, but like, that's not why they came to work there.
I'm laughing because the organization that I work for, we use a medical record of a company that you've made a lot of comments that have all of these things. They have some of the world's best chefs at this company. They do have a slide. I've slid down it.
Sorry that I slammed the slide. No, but it happens. I had this conversation a week ago with a bunch of different entrepreneurs, and I basically published a piece, and then in this entrepreneurship community, and somebody saw it and they said, hey, this is such a cool piece about culture. What are you doing to build culture? 9 out of the 10 comments were perks or benefits. And like, I wanted to applaud them and go, hey, these are great. But I also wanted to be like, guys, this is not, you're headed for trouble. This is not culture. Culture isn't a foosball table in the break room.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or beer after work, something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It really is.
Things can happen. Like this, like actually food. Let's go back to food, chef quad, because I picked on Google, et cetera. Like 12 years ago, I watched a talk. I was speaking, or I don't think I was speaking, which is a bigger problem, but that's a different monologue. But I watched a talk from Douglas Merrill, who was one of the original CIOs at Google, right? I don't know where he works now, but he was talking about the free food. And he said, the thing nobody ever talks about is that if you go to the Mountain View campus and you get your free food and you turn around to go look for a place to sit, you will never find a 1-top or a 2-top table. Minimum of 4 seats at every table. Usually it's 10 to 12 seats. The reason for the free food is that it forces people out of the cubicle where they code to sit down with people they wouldn't normally interact with, talk about problems that they're having, trade ideas, make connections. Like, it's not actually about the food and attracting people to the food. It's that if we pay for the food, you'll eat the food here and interact with people, and then we'll get a better cross-pollination of ideas and we'll have a better overall product. There's always something under the surface of those little things we're looking at. And that's why it boggles my mind that we advertise those things. Why do we advertise the slide? What does the slide actually represent, right? Why do we advertise the chef quality food? What are we actually trying to accomplish with it? And if you don't have an answer to that, well, then I can save you a ton of money on your annual expenditures.
It sounds kind of like that features versus benefits thing that they do for products. So it's like, these are the features of the iPhone, but what are the actual benefits? It's just like that, but for humans.
Yeah, totally. I mean, full credit where credit is due. This is a whole model from a psychologist named Edgar Schein. he talks about artifacts, espoused values, and underlying basic assumptions, like 3 tiers, like the iceberg idea. We see the artifacts, but underneath that in a company culture is a set of shared values, not core values, shared values, right? Because we might not all agree, especially when we have like 10 or 12, they're not all core. And then underneath that is a basic assumptions, a set of worldview, a thing we all share and believe. And like real culture is the values, and the artifacts are what we often point to. But the goal is to get those to be representative of the espoused values or the basic underlying beliefs, et cetera. So yes, it's a lot like the features and benefits thing. It's also like the guy whose idea I just stole from, whose name is Edgar Schein, and now I give him credit. So it's not stealing, it's just research.
Not stealing, it's just research. There we go.
It's just a reference. Yeah. And if you were to ask anybody that would leave that company, of course, they're not going to say it's the slide and it's not the food.
Right.
It's just, that's really not the point. Or why do you stay? Has nothing to do with the food or the buildings or the slides. So yeah, exactly. I totally understand what you're saying.
I think the slides and stuff for me would be, yeah, that brings a sense of fun. I don't know. Sometimes offices get so stuffy.
For sure, if people actually use it, right? Yeah. But like if you haven't already cultivated an environment where people feel like they can like let their hair down and be fun around each other, then the slide doesn't do anything, right? If you've got an office environment where everybody shows up, sits in their cubicle, occasionally goes to the water cooler or the coffee machine, and then goes back to their cubicle, slide's not going to help that, right? There's some bigger things we need to do. And then maybe a slide helps but like you already need to do that fun environment first.
So how do you cultivate that in a completely remote, like let's say you're a brand new company and you have people working from all over, so many of these companies, you have a social media person who works and
yeah.
How do you create a culture virtually, completely virtual?
Yeah. So and we talk about this a bit in Leading From Anywhere. So I think the first thing you do is you build that sense of shared understanding or common understanding, right? You want people to get to know the person behind the work too. And in a remote environment, it's way too easy to feel like your colleagues are like non-playable characters in a video game. I typed an email out to Robin, click send, and then I sit and wait for a response. The same way, like when you're playing a video game, you can select like 3 responses and then there's a pre-programmed thing that, right? Like it could be way too, and we would never say that, but it can be really easy to think of colleagues like that, right? Yeah. Like I've been waiting for an email all day from somebody and it annoys me because I'm like, well, in the video game, but anyway, that's a whole other monologue. So you want to get to know the person behind that, right? You want to build that sense of shared understanding. A couple different ways you do that. All of them involve creating moments of self-disclosure, right? Moments where people can talk about non-work things. So this could be the beer after hours. This could be the free food. In a remote environment, this usually has to be making deliberate time for conversation before or after our Zoom meetings, right? So let's say the meeting starts at 10. Why don't you jump on at 9:50? Tell people, hey, I'm running early. If anyone wants to hang out, right? Send that email at 9:50. See who shows up and just kind of hang out the way we used to do in person when we did it, right? Other times you need to be a bit more structured. Like one of my favorite activities that I learned from a different team is called, it's an icebreaker. And I feel weird because icebreakers give me that like weird 1990s company trainer vibe, but it actually works. It's called 3 Snaps. It's sort of a fake Instagram type of thing. The idea being you go through your camera roll and you pick 3 photos that kind of represent you and your life and what you're about, and you share them at the start of the meeting. And next week, a different person does their 3 snaps. And over the course of a couple of weeks, right, you get to know that person. So that what all of those things do is those things create opportunities to find uncommon commonalities, things that one person or 2 people on a team have in common with each other, the rest of the team doesn't have, right? They both find out that, hey, when you were a kid, you both loved professional wrestling, or hey, when you were in college, you both spent the summer in the south of France, right? Like you find those things in common, that creates deeper conversations. The fancy word that I get into in Friend of a Friend is that creates multiplex ties, different reasons to connect, reach out, have a conversation with that person than just work related. And multiplex ties are the beginnings of friendships. And we know that friendships at work are strongly predictive of engagement. They're strongly predictive of productivity. They're predictive of that fun thing as well. They're even predictive of tenure, right? People stick around longer when they feel like they have personal connections. That all starts with uncommon commonalities. So the difference in a remote environment is you have to be very deliberate about those. In a in a mediocre co-located company, a decent percentage of people will find those accidentally, usually the extroverts, the social butterflies, etc. In a well-run co-located company, will create deliberate experiences that allow that opportunity for everyone. The stakes are a lot higher when we go remote. You're either deliberate and some people take advantage of it, or you're not deliberate and nobody does and everybody feels alone, right? So it makes that deliberateness much more important.
I think that's definitely the kicker right there, is the deliberateness. Because I think a lot of people, now that we've become so much more productive, we think we can fit so much more in. I know a lot of people that I've talked to just about working remotely is like, well, they're like, well, I'm at home. I get on, earlier, I leave later because I'm always at my computer. And they're like, well, people, they're just constantly at their computer. So I think the deliberate part is making sure we spend time getting to know each other and keeping. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think as we head towards a more flexible work arrangement where people are back in the offices, some of those things will go back to happening by accident. But the irony is there's a real danger there, in that if we just go, great, now we don't have to pay attention to it again, like we're headed back to taking chances with culture.
Yeah.
Great in-person organizations still create those deliberate opportunities. So we need to do that, and we need to make sure they're inclusive, whether you're co-located or remote.
Right.
I love that. Definitely. I'll be using that skill.
Well, cool. Yeah. Try 3 snaps. Let me know how it goes.
I will, for sure.
At a meeting too.
Yeah. David, it has been great talking to you. We will put your website out there for people. I'll put it on LinkedIn. I know you're very heavily involved in LinkedIn. I find your stuff all the time, and 15 minutes later, I'm watching another video and got to get back to work now. So
yeah, I mean, the good news is it's content you can watch at work and not feel guilty, right? Like
exactly. And I tell
boys love watching. My boys love watching Dude Perfect, but like you can't watch those in the middle of workday and not feel guilty, right?
Right.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It has been wonderful talking with you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. And then to our listeners, stay awesome.
And keep reaching for your anything.
Guys.
Thank you.